Operation Paperclip. The war is over. The Nazis lost. Now picture the victors walking into a factory carved into the heart of a mountain in central Germany, a place built by slaves where 20,000 people died assembling weapons designed to destroy London. Picture them looking at the weapons, looking at the men who built them, and then, instead of handcuffs, handing them a paycheck and an American passport. This is not a metaphor. This is not a film. This happened. In the final days of May 1945, the United States government launched a classified program that would be known as Operation Paperclip. Its purpose was simple, and its implications were staggering. Recruit the scientists of the Third Reich, bring them to America, and build the future on what they knew. Historian Annie Jacobsen documented the full scope of the program in her 2014 book based on 75,000 newly declassified documents. What she found wasn't just a Cold War calculation, it was a systematic falsification of history. The most famous recruit was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the Vi-2 rocket and a major in the SS. He had personally visited the Dora concentration camp, where prisoners were worked to death assembling the very weapons he designed. Historian Michael Neufeld confirmed that visit in his 2007 biography. Von Braun was not prosecuted. He was given an office, a security clearance, and eventually the directorship of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He designed the Saturn V rocket. He put Americans on the moon. He was not alone. Arthur Rudolph, operations director at the Mittelwerk Underground Factory, had been directly responsible for the recruitment of slave labor from Dora. He was brought to the United States under Paperclip and spent the next 4 decades directing the Saturn V program without a word of public accountability. He was not investigated until 1984, nearly 40 years after the war ended. When he surrendered his citizenship and left the country quietly. No charges. No trial. Hubertus Strughold, called the father of space medicine, had overseen experiments at Dachau in which prisoners were submerged in ice water and placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions. He was brought to the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine and spent years lecturing American astronauts on how the human body behaves in space. The data he brought with him was not generated ethically. The people it was generated on did not survive. JIOA Director Bosque Webb wrote in an internal memo in 1947 that the national interest required overriding State Department security reviews that had flagged recruits as, in the department's own language, ardent Nazis and potential security threats. At least 16 recruits with files flagged in those terms were admitted anyway. The word paperclip itself came from the actual metal clips agents used to mark the files they wanted approved. History has a blunt sense of humor. The program remained classified until 1973. The full participant list wasn't released until a Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act review in 1999. 54 years after the war ended. The standard historical defense is strategic necessity. The Soviet Union ran its own equivalent program, Operation Osoaviahim, forcibly relocating roughly 2,500 German specialists to the USSR in a single night in October 1946. Without Paperclip, the argument goes, Moscow would have had a decade's head start in both space and weapons development. The knowledge was too valuable to leave on the table. That argument is not entirely without merit, but here is the part that doesn't fit. There is a difference between saying, "We need this man, despite what he did," and fabricating a paper trail that says he never did it. The United States government didn't just hire war criminals, it manufactured new identities for them. It rewrote their histories. And then it locked the evidence away for half a century. The same government that argued at Nuremberg that crimes against humanity have no political justification was simultaneously classifying the names of the men it had quietly rescued from accountability for those crimes. What else was in those 75,000 documents? What is in the portion still withheld? And if the men who built America's space program were the same men who built weapons in death camps, what exactly are we celebrating when we celebrate the moon landing? Paperclip didn't just bring rocket scientists to America, it brought the philosophy that human beings were a resource, that the mind and the body could be broken open and used. And the CIA was paying very close attention. MKUltra, April 13, 1953. CIA Director Allen Dulles personally authorizes a program that will run for 20 years, span 80 institutions, and use hundreds of ordinary people as unwitting test subjects. He calls it MKUltra. You will not read about it in most history textbooks. You know about it only because someone forgot to burn 20,000 pages of financial records before the subpoena arrived. Imagine you are a patient. You checked yourself into a Montreal psychiatric hospital for mild depression. You are not a spy. You are not a criminal. You are not a soldier. You have done nothing wrong. You will not leave the same person. In fact, large parts of you will not leave at all. Subproject 68, run by Scottish-born psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute, involved a technique Cameron called psychic driving. Patients were placed in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time, up to 86 days in one documented case, while recorded phrases played on continuous loop in their ears. The goal was to erase the existing personality and, theoretically, replace it with something more compliant. Some patients lost years of memories permanently. Many never fully recovered. Cameron published academic papers on his methods. He won awards. He was president of both the American and the World Psychiatric Associations. The CIA paid him through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The Canadian government also contributed funding. In 1992, the Canadian government paid $100,000 in settlements to 77 of Cameron's surviving victims. Cameron himself had died in 1967 while hiking. No charges were ever filed. Subproject 3 involved the covert administration of LSD to people who had no idea they were being drugged. Among them was Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist dosed without his knowledge at a retreat in November 1953. 9 days later, he fell from the 10th floor of a New York hotel. His death was ruled a suicide. His body was exhumed in 1994. Forensic pathologist James Starrs found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull inconsistent with a fall. No one has ever been charged. At least 44 universities and colleges participated in MKUltra research, including Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia. Most had no idea the funding came from the CIA. Sidney Gottlieb, the program's chemist and driving force, ordered the destruction of all records in January 1973, 2 days after Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox subpoenaed CIA files. Gottlieb testified before Congress in 1977, citing a poor memory. He died in 1999. No charges, no trial. What survived was the accident. A CIA archivist in 1977 found approximately 20,000 documents in a financial records building in Warrenton, Virginia, overlooked during the destruction order because they were filed under budget rather than operations. The Senate Church Committee and the subsequent 1977 hearings confirmed the program's scope. 150 sub-projects, 80 institutions, 20 years. Most of the results, ASH, the intelligence community's defense, is Cold War context. The Soviets were believed to have developed genuine brainwashing techniques based on the behavior of American POWs in Korea, who made public confessions on camera. The CIA felt it was in a cognitive arms race it couldn't afford to lose. The program was shut down, the argument goes, because mind control as imagined simply didn't work. The results weren't there. But that explanation asks you to accept that a program lasting 20 years, surviving 6 internal reviews, and expanding across 80 institutions was kept alive purely by failure. Institutions don't sustain failures for 2 decades. Something was working well enough to keep the funding flowing. What it was is in the files that were burned. And there is a question that no official history has satisfactorily answered. Subproject 54 aimed to produce amnesia and concussion using targeted sound waves. Techniques for doing exactly that appeared in classified CRE training manuals used at Guantanamo Bay in 2002. Did MKUltra end, or did it graduate? From the laboratories of North America, we travel 6,000 miles east to a frozen complex in northeastern China. A different program, a different government, a different century. But the same philosophy, that certain human beings are available for use. The difference is that this one wasn't hidden, because no one who went in came out to talk. Unit 731. They were called Maruta. It means logs. That was the word the researchers used for the human beings inside the facility. Not prisoners, not patients, not people. Logs, and logs exist to be cut. The complex sat in the Pingfang district of Harbin, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, disguised from the outside as a lumber mill. It covered 6 square kilometers. It was surrounded by electric fences. Inside, it was known simply as the factory. Between 1937 and 1945, it processed thousands of human beings in the name of science. And when the war ended, the United States government made a decision about what to do with the men who ran it. That decision was buried for half a century. Unit 731 was the Imperial Japanese Army's Biological Warfare Research Division, established under a formal military directive in 1936. Its founding director, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, had been lobbying since 1930 for exactly this kind of facility, arguing that the 1925 Geneva Protocol's ban on chemical weapons proved how devastatingly effective they were. He was given his factory. He was given his subjects. He used both. The experiments were not fringe. They were systematic, documented, and conducted by credentialed physicians from Japan's most prestigious universities, who rotated through Pingfang on research secondments as if it were a teaching hospital. Subjects were infected with bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax to study disease progression in living tissue. Autopsies were performed without anesthetic on conscious patients to obtain what the researchers called uncontaminated organ data. Frostbite experiments involved limbs being repeatedly frozen and thawed, then broken or surgically removed to document tissue damage at each stage. Pressure chamber tests measured at what atmospheric conditions the human body simply ceased to function. Over 3,000 deaths are confirmed by Japanese government records. Estimates by historians, including Sheldon Harris, whose 1994 book Factories of Death drew on declassified U.S. intelligence files, placed the true figure considerably higher. When the war ended, Ishii made his calculation. He had data. America wanted data. He negotiated. In 1949, U.S. biological warfare researcher Edwin Hill filed a classified report concluding that the Unit 731 data was of great value and could not have been obtained through research permitted under ethical guidelines. His recommendation was formal immunity in exchange for full cooperation. The arrangement was accepted. Every commander, every researcher, every physician who had participated in the program was granted protection from prosecution. The Soviet Union attempted to introduce Unit 731 evidence at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. American officials blocked it. The program's data directly informed the U.S. biological weapons program at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which remained classified until President Nixon ordered its termination in 1969. Researcher Shiro Kasahara published academic papers after the war based on Unit 731 data under his own name in Japanese medical journals. He was not sanctioned. The Japanese government did not formally acknowledge the program's existence until a Tokyo District Court ruling in 1997. 52 years after the fact. The standard historical defense is a Cold War calculation, and it is not entirely without internal logic. The data existed. The Soviets were attempting to obtain it. A public trial would have put every experimental result into an open court record accessible to Moscow. In the emerging strategic competition, biological warfare capability was considered essential. The immunity deal in this framing was the lesser of two evils. But that framing requires accepting a very specific moral architecture. The Nuremberg trials, running simultaneously, established as a foundational principle of international law that crimes against humanity carry no political justification, that following orders is not a defense, and that the prohibition on human experimentation is absolute. The Tokyo Tribunal operated under the same stated principles. It reached different conclusions. The difference was American strategic interest. What is in the Unit 731 data files still held at Fort Detrick? Were any Allied prisoners of war among the subjects? Declassified documents suggest the answer is yes. No names have ever been officially confirmed, and the researchers who generated that data died in their beds, published in their fields, and were protected for decades by the government that built its space program on the same philosophy. Some questions don't have answers, they have implications. And the implication here, the one that governments don't want named, is that Nuremberg and Tokyo didn't represent equal justice. They represented a decision about whose crimes counted. The answer depended entirely on whether the crimes were useful. From state-sanctioned atrocity, we move to something stranger. Something that asks not what governments are willing to do to human beings, but what certain human beings might be capable of doing that governments aren't willing to admit. Because starting in 1972, the United States funded a program to find out. And what they found was either impossible or the most important discovery in human history. The Stargate Project. The year is 1979. A U.S. Army intelligence officer sits in a windowless room at Fort Meade, Maryland. He has been given a set of geographic coordinates, nothing else, no photographs, no maps, no satellite imagery, no briefing of any kind. He closes his eyes, breathes, and begins to describe what he sees. A massive underground complex, high-altitude location, unusual cooling systems, large cylindrical objects being moved on rail cars. He hands over his notes. What he was not told is that the coordinates point to a Soviet nuclear facility in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. His description matches the satellite imagery that the U.S. had spent years and billions of dollars obtaining through conventional means. This is the Stargate project. And it was not a fringe experiment. It was a classified U.S. government program that ran for 23 years, employed personnel from the CIA, the DIA, the Army, the Navy, and the NSA, spent an estimated $20 million, and produced results that a peer-reviewed statistician later said exceeded what would be expected by chance to a degree that would be significant in virtually any other area of science. Physicists Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff began the foundational research at Stanford Research Institute in 1972 under CIA contract. Their subject was a technique they called remote viewing, the ability to describe a physical location or object using only coordinates or sealed photographs with no other information. The initial results were startling enough that they published them in the peer-reviewed journal Nature in 1974, despite significant editorial resistance. The scientific establishment was not pleased. The operational program that grew from that research used trained military personnel as remote viewers, deploying them on actual intelligence missions with actual targets. Remote viewer Joe McMoneagle, designated Remote Viewer 001, described the interior configuration of a Soviet Typhoon-class submarine under construction in 1979, 7 months before Western intelligence confirmed the vessel's existence through satellite imagery. McMoneagle received the Legion of Merit for his operational contributions to national intelligence. The Legion of Merit is not awarded for coincidences. In an earlier session, remote viewer Ingo Swan was given only the coordinates 49 degrees 20 minutes south, 70 degrees 14 minutes east. Nothing else. He described a small island with a Soviet weather station, a small aircraft landing strip, and specific topographic features. Cartographic verification later confirmed those coordinates pointed to the remote sub-Antarctic island of Kerguelen. His description was accurate. When the program was eventually reviewed in 1995, the CIA commissioned an independent assessment from the American Institutes for Research. The panel included statistician Jessica Utz and psychologist Ray Hyman, who was brought in as the designated skeptic. Utz concluded that the statistical results could not be attributed to chance. Hyman, while declining to endorse a paranormal explanation, agreed that the results were anomalous and could not be explained by methodological flaws alone. The program was terminated not because the results were negative. It was terminated officially because there was no scientific theory to explain how positive results were possible. The program survived 23 years and at least 6 internal reviews that recommended its cancellation and was overridden each time. Someone kept finding the results too interesting to abandon. The mainstream view is that the positive results reflect well-documented cognitive biases, inadequate blinding protocols, and the file drawer problem where failed sessions were underreported relative to successes. Psychologists argue that human pattern recognition is so powerful and human memory so unreliable that what looks like anomalous accuracy is simply selective recall. That is a serious argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But it doesn't explain the Legion of Merit. It doesn't explain why the program was kept alive through 6 reviews that recommended killing it. And it doesn't explain why the Soviet Union, entirely independently, ran an equivalent program called Psychotronics that at its peak employed over 300 full-time researchers. The 1995 declassification was partial. The operational files, the mission logs, the full record of what was asked and what was answered remain classified. We know what survived the review process. We do not know what was considered too sensitive to release. If the publicly admitted results included a Legion of Merit and statistically impossible accuracy rates, the question of what the full record contains is not a trivial one. Some abilities are not supposed to exist. That is the comfortable position. What is less comfortable is the possibility that they do, that a 23-year government program found evidence that they do, and that the evidence is sitting in a classified file somewhere being protected from a theory that hasn't been invented yet. From the dark rooms of Fort Meade, we move to a different kind of darkness. The kind that falls over a hotel room in New York City at 10:45 on the night of January 7th, 1943, when the greatest electrical mind in human history dies alone. And the men who show up before morning aren't there to mourn. The suppressed Tesla files. Nikola Tesla died alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel Manhattan having given the world alternating current electricity, the radio, and the fluorescent light, and received almost nothing in return. He was 86 years old, penniless, and had been feeding pigeons from the window ledge because they were the only company he had. Within hours of his death, before his body had been moved, men with government credentials were already going through his papers. That was not grief. That was retrieval. Tesla had spent 60 years generating technical documentation. He held 300 patents across 26 countries. At the time of his death, he was working on 2 projects that his funders had spent decades ensuring would never see completion. The first was a wireless global power transmission system, tested at his Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island before financier J.P. Morgan defunded it in 1903. The second was what Tesla called a teleforce weapon, a directed energy beam capable of destroying aircraft at a distance of 250 miles, specifications for which he had offered to multiple governments in the years before his death. The Office of Alien Property seized all 84 boxes of Tesla's belongings and papers. This in itself is strange. Tesla had been a naturalized American citizen since 1891. The evaluation of his technical materials was assigned to Dr. John G. Trump, an electrical engineer at MIT and technical director of the National Defense Research Committee. Trump completed his evaluation in 3 days. 3 days for 84 boxes of papers from a man who had spent 60 years filling them. His written conclusion, now publicly available through the FBI's online vault, was that the materials contained nothing which would be of value to this country's enemies. Not nothing of value, nothing of value to enemies. The phrasing is precise in a way that tells you more about what they were looking for than what they found. The Wardenclyffe project had not been abandoned for scientific reasons. Morgan's withdrawal of funding came specifically after Tesla revealed that the system would provide free electrical power to anyone with a receiving antenna. There was no way to put a meter on it. Morgan pulled $150,000 in 1903. The tower sat unfinished for 14 years before being demolished in 1917. The reason it was demolished was not science. It was economics. Tesla submitted a technical memorandum on his teleforce weapon to the Yugoslav government in 1937. He offered specifications to the British, Soviet, and American governments. The British declined. The Soviets reportedly paid him $25,000 for a preliminary document. The American government apparently felt the matter was best handled through property seizure rather than negotiation. In 2016, the FBI released 250 pages of Tesla-related documents through its public vault. They confirmed the seizure. They confirmed Trump's evaluation. And they confirmed that the FBI maintained active interest in Tesla's files through at least the 1950s, more than a decade after his death. Why an agency maintains active interest in the papers of a deceased inventor for over a decade is a question the released files do not answer. The U.S. Air Force's active denial system, a directed energy weapon that causes intense heat sensation at distance through targeted millimeter wave energy, was publicly revealed in 2001. Tesla's theoretical teleforce specifications, as he described them in interviews and patents from the 1930s, operate on structurally similar principles. Whether there is a direct line between those specifications and what was eventually developed is not information in the public domain. The standard historical position is that Tesla's later work was theoretically interesting but practically undeveloped. The concepts existed without the engineering specifications required to replicate them. The seizure was precautionary and legally routine under wartime property rules. The evaluation found nothing of significance because there was nothing of significance to find. But 3 days is not an evaluation. 3 days is a search conducted with a specific objective. And the specific objective, given what we know about what Tesla was working on, was almost certainly whether the Teleforce weapon was real and whether the wireless power system could be completed. The answer to both questions, in the publicly available version of the story, is no. The classified version of the story is still in a box somewhere. What did governments spend decades ensuring would never be built? And why, 70 years after Tesla's death, with all the resources of modern physics and engineering, has no institution publicly replicated wireless power transmission at the scale he claimed was possible? The answer is either that he was wrong, or that the answer to that question is itself not available to us. From a lone inventor whose papers were seized before his body was cold, we move to something with witnesses. Dozens of them. With security clearances, with official documentation, with a tape recorder running in real time. In a forest in England, in December of 1980, 3 consecutive nights of something that no government has ever explained. The Rendlesham Forest incident. It is 3 a.m. on December 26, 1980. 2 U.S. Air Force security patrolmen at a NATO base in Suffolk, England, see lights descending into the adjacent forest. They assume it is a downed aircraft. They radio their supervisor, take a vehicle to the tree line, and walk in. What they find is not a plane. And what happens over the 3 nights that follow will generate an official U.S. Air Force memorandum, measurable radiation readings, physical ground trace evidence in the soil, and audio recorded live by the deputy base commander, who has held his rank for 20 years and has absolutely no reason to fabricate any of it. The primary document in the Rendlesham case is the Halt Memorandum, written by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, Deputy Base Commander at RAF Woodbridge, and addressed formally to the British Ministry of Defense on January 13, 1981. It was obtained under the United States Freedom of Information Act in 1983. It describes, in standard military report language, a triangular-shaped craft approximately 2 to 3 meters across, hovering or resting on legs, shining a beam of light at the feet of the approaching airmen before moving away through the trees. This is not a tabloid story, it is a government document. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston was among the first personnel on the scene on the night of December 26th. He filed an official security report the same night. He reported approaching the craft, observing raised symbols on its surface and touching it. He sketched the symbols in his notebook. His notebook was subsequently confiscated by OSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. It was returned to him years later. Pages were missing. The physical landing site was examined the following morning. 3 circular depressions were measured, each approximately 7 inches deep, forming an equilateral triangle, roughly 3 meters apart, consistent with landing gear. Radiation measurements taken with a Geiger counter at the depressions showed readings of approximately 0.1 milliroentgens per hour, compared to a background level of 0.03 milliroentgens. That is a factor of more than 3 above normal. That reading does not come from a lighthouse. On the 3rd night, Halt himself went into the forest with a small team, carrying a handheld tape recorder. The recording, which has been publicly released, captures 18 minutes of live narration from a deputy base commander describing a craft moving through the trees, beaming light into the base's nuclear weapons storage area, and then dividing into 5 separate objects. Behind Halt's voice on that tape is the voice of a man who is confused and unsettled by something he cannot explain. It is not the voice of a man who is performing. He had nothing to gain by lying on a tape recorder in the dark. Former UK Chief of Defence Staff Lord Hill Norton raised the matter in the House of Lords in 2002. His formulation of the logical problem has never been answered. Either something real happened adjacent to a NATO nuclear base, in which case it carries enormous defense significance and demands a full official accounting, or senior U.S. Air Force officers fabricated an official government memorandum, in which case there is a serious breach of military discipline that equally demands a full official accounting. Neither possibility had been addressed. Both remain unaddressed to this day. The British Ministry of Defense released its investigation files in 2009. The investigation consisted primarily of receiving Halt's memo and filing it. No follow-up interviews, no independent radiation assessment, no radar data analysis. The file was labeled Unexplained Lights. The ministry's conclusion was that the incident had no defense significance. Lord Hill Norton's logical objection applies here with full force. The skeptical explanation is the Orfordness Lighthouse, whose rotating beam was visible through the trees from the base. Astronomer Ian Ridpath has argued that inexperienced security personnel in an unfamiliar dark environment could have misidentified the lighthouse beam as something more dramatic, and that the radiation readings fell within natural variation. These are not unreasonable arguments, but Halt was not an inexperienced security patrolman. He was a 20-year military officer who had served at that base long enough to know the surrounding landscape. The lighthouse had been rotating in the same arc every night for years without ever previously being mistaken for a landed craft. And a lighthouse does not leave triangular indentations in the soil at measurable depth. A lighthouse does not produce elevated radiation readings at specific ground points. And a lighthouse does not appear on radar before that radar data is classified. What exactly was the beam doing in the nuclear storage area? What did the radar operators record on those 3 nights? What was removed from Peniston's notebook? These are not questions about lights in a forest. They are questions about an official government document that has never received an official government answer. From documented military encounters in a Suffolk forest, we travel across the Atlantic to a valley in Utah where the U.S. government didn't just investigate the unexplained, it bought the land, staffed it with scientists from a defense intelligence agency, and told them to live inside the phenomenon. What they found was classified. What leaked out was enough to confirm that something at that location was considered significant enough to warrant $22 million of black budget funding and the attention of the United States Senate. Skinwalker Ranch. The Ute people have a name for the land. They have had it for generations. The name translates roughly as the place where the skinwalker roams, and the Ute will not go there after dark. They did not sell it. They did not develop it. They left it alone with a specificity that speaks to something older and more consistent than a local superstition. A family named Sherman bought the ranch in 1994. 512 acres in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah. Good cattle country on paper. They lasted 3 years. In that time, they reported 14 cattle mutilations, each characterized by surgical removal of specific organs with no blood at the scene, no tracks in the surrounding soil, and no conventional explanation that satisfied them or the investigators they brought in. They reported objects moving through the house. They reported orbs of light that passed through solid walls. And they reported an incident involving a creature that absorbed 3 rifle rounds at point-blank range before retreating into a luminous opening in the air that closed behind it. They sold the ranch to aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow in 1996 for approximately $200,000. They left because they had reached the limit of what they were willing to endure. What happened next is not a ghost story. It is a line item in the United States federal budget. Senator Harry Reid of Nevada secured $22 million in black budget funding in 2008 for a program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, AAWSAP, administered by the Defense Intelligence Agency through a contract with Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, who owned the ranch. The program was first publicly confirmed in a New York Times investigation in December 2017. Reed stated publicly that he was not embarrassed or ashamed to have funded the research. The program generated close to 1,000 field reports. The bulk of those reports remain classified under DIA control. Dr. James Lakatsky, a DIA engineer and AAWSAP director, visited the ranch in 2007 before the formal program was established. During his visit, he personally observed a translucent object the size of a volleyball hovering near the ceiling of the ranch house before vanishing. This account comes from his 2021 co-authored book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, published with Security Review. That visit, according to the book, is what motivated Lakatsky to brief the Senate and pursue formal government involvement. A DIA engineer doesn't spend the political capital required to secure $22 million in classified funding over a misidentified reflection. Dr. Colum Kelleher, a biochemist who led the on-site research team for the National Institute for Discovery Science from 1996 to 2004, documented something that resists easy categorization in the case files. Multiple BAASS research personnel began reporting anomalous phenomena in their personal residences after conducting fieldwork at the ranch. Objects moving, lights appearing, the same categories of event that occurred on the property occurring in their homes hundreds of miles away. Kelleher called it the hitchhiker effect. It does not fit the standard UAP framework. A craft in the sky does not follow a researcher to a house in another state. Whatever was happening at Skinwalker Ranch, some researchers believe it was not confined to its coordinates. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted during the televised investigation, running from 2020 onward, identified a buried anomaly in the north pasture at a depth of approximately 50 feet of unknown origin. Gamma radiation measurements in specific areas of the property registered consistently above background. Whether these findings have been shared with the DIA and what the DIA's assessment of them is not public information. The skeptical position is coherent and deserves its hearing. Cattle mutilation has documented conventional explanations involving predators, bloat, and natural decomposition. UAP sightings in remote rural Utah are statistically likely to be misidentifications of aircraft, satellites, or atmospheric phenomena. Confirmation bias in a location with a loaded cultural history is a powerful force. The government funding reflects a reasonable assessment that anomalous claims should be investigated even if their cause is ultimately mundane. But the hitchhiker effect doesn't fit any of that. And the classification of nearly 1,000 scientific field reports from a private cattle ranch in Utah has no straightforward national security justification unless what those reports describe is itself the sensitive material. The Ute people avoided this land for generations before the U.S. government spent $22 million studying it. That is either a remarkable coincidence or it is information. From a valley in Utah where something was classified, we moved to something even stranger. Not a place, but a question about time itself. About whether the calendar we use to structure human history contains nearly 3 centuries of years that may, according to one German historian's meticulous mathematical argument, never have happened at all. The phantom time hypothesis. What if Charlemagne never existed? What if the Dark Ages were dark for a very specific reason, because a significant portion of them were invented? What if approximately 297 years of documented history, complete with kings and battles and chronicles and architecture, were fabricated and inserted into the calendar, and every piece of evidence from that period was either forged, misdated, or created specifically to fill a gap that should not be there? This is not a rumor from the internet. It is a formally published academic hypothesis by German historian and publisher Heribert Illig, first presented in 1991 in a paper titled, in translation, Did Charlemagne Ever Live?, and expanded in his 1996 book, The Invented Middle Ages. The mainstream has rejected it, but the mathematical foundation on which it rests has never been cleanly refuted. The argument begins with a calendar correction. When Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BC, it accumulated a known discrepancy of approximately 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year relative to the solar year. By the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, that drift amounted to roughly 3 days. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar in 1582, his astronomers needed to correct for the full accumulated drift since Nicaea. Based on the actual elapsed time, that correction should have been approximately 13 days. Gregory removed 10. The 3-day gap corresponds, in Illig's calculation, to approximately 267 to 297 years. Illig's hypothesis is that those years were manufactured, that around the year 1000 AD, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, and Pope Sylvester II, 3 rulers with the motive of placing themselves at the symbolically resonant turn of the first Christian millennium, conspired to redact and fabricate the documentary record of the preceding 3 centuries, populating them with invented figures including, Illig argues, Charlemagne himself. The archaeological record of the Carolingian period is, compared to the eras immediately before and after it, conspicuously thin. Many structures attributed to Charlemagne's empire have been subsequently reclassified as either Merovingian or Ottonian in origin. The chronicle record for the early Middle Ages is dominated by very few primary sources, most of which exist only as later copies. Charlemagne himself is known almost entirely through Einhard's biography, written decades after his supposed death, with no surviving independent contemporary source from the period to corroborate it. The mainstream objection to phantom time is substantial and cannot be dismissed. Islamic astronomical records from the supposedly fabricated period document solar and lunar eclipses with dates that can be independently verified against modern calculations. Chinese dynastic records do the same. These are civilizations that had no reason to participate in a European conspiracy and no contact with the parties Illig names. If 297 years were inserted into European history, the Islamic and Chinese records would have to be fabricated as well. That requires a scale of coordination that strains any reasonable hypothesis. Illig has addressed this, arguing that some Islamic records are themselves copies of copies with uncertain original dating, and that the astronomical verification relies on back calculation that could itself carry embedded assumptions. Historians have not found this response convincing. The consensus remains firmly against him. But the interesting question is not whether Illig is right. The interesting question is why the calendar mathematics produce a number that corresponds so precisely to a historically sparse period, and why that correspondence has not received a clean mathematical resolution in the primary literature. The 3-day Gregorian discrepancy is a real number. It has not been conclusively explained by imprecision in the Nicene baseline alone. And some researchers have noted that dendrochronological records, the reading of tree rings from European oak samples, show a notable anomaly in growth patterns around the late 7th and early 8th centuries, a period corresponding to a known catastrophic volcanic winter in 536 AD that caused global crop failure and may have collapsed multiple civilizations simultaneously. What if phantom time is wrong in its conspiracy framing, but correct in its observation? What if the early Middle Ages weren't fabricated but genuinely collapsed? What if a civilization-ending event in the 500s so disrupted timekeeping, record-keeping, and institutional memory across the Northern Hemisphere that the centuries that followed were, in a very real sense, unmeasured? And what if the calendar discrepancy is not evidence of forgery, but evidence of a catastrophe so complete that no one left knew how to count the years correctly afterward? We may never know. What we do know is that a German historian asked a mathematical question in 1991 that the mainstream has not yet answered with a number, and that questions without clean answers tend to accumulate meaning over time. From a debate about what may have been inserted into the past, we move to something that happened in the present and was immediately buried. In the South Atlantic Ocean, at 12:53 in the morning on September 22, 1979, a U.S. satellite recorded something that had never produced a false reading in 10 years of operation. And then, under direct political pressure, the finding was revised to say it probably hadn't happened. The Vela incident. At 12:53 in the morning on September 22, 1979, a U.S. Vela satellite designated 6911 recorded a double flash of light over the South Atlantic Ocean near the sub-Antarctic Prince Edward Islands. That double flash, two pulses of light in a specific sequence, one rapid and extremely bright followed by a slower, dimmer emission, is the unmistakable optical signature of a nuclear detonation. It is the signature the Vela satellite system was specifically designed and built to detect. In 10 years and 41 confirmed nuclear tests, the satellite had never produced a false positive. No nation claimed the test. What followed was one of the most consequential acts of deliberate institutional blindness in the history of nuclear nonproliferation. The U.S. Air Force Technical Applications Center, AFTAS, which operates the nuclear monitoring system and had 10 years of operational experience reading Vela data, concluded that the signal was consistent with a nuclear detonation of approximately 2 to 3 kilotons. That assessment was the technically informed one from the people who had spent a decade doing exactly this work. It was overridden. The Carter White House convened a science advisors panel led by MIT physicist Jack Ruina, which became known as the Ruina Panel. The panel's finding, delivered in 1980, was that the signal was probably not a nuclear detonation and most likely resulted from an anomalous interaction between a meteoroid and the satellite's sensors. The findings satisfied almost no one, including several members of the panel itself. The meteoroid hypothesis has a specific and fatal problem. The Vela satellites had been struck by meteoroids before. In 10 years of operation, no meteoroid strike had ever mimicked the double flash signature. Physicist Luis Alvarez, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, reviewed the hypothesis and stated publicly that the probability of a meteoroid strike accidentally replicating the precise optical sequence of a nuclear detonation was effectively zero. The signature the satellite was built to detect is not a simple flash. It is a specific temporal sequence generated by the dynamics of a nuclear fireball interacting with the atmosphere. It is not something that happens by accident. Historian Avner Cohen and journalist William Burr, writing for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 2016, published newly declassified documents showing that the Carter administration's internal assessment was that the signal was almost certainly a test, almost certainly joint between Israel and South Africa, and that the political decision to suppress the Ruina panel's true working conclusion was driven by the timing. The Camp David Accords had been signed just 11 days before the event. Acknowledging an Israeli nuclear test would have triggered mandatory U.S. sanctions under the Symington Amendment and destroyed the diplomatic architecture that Carter had spent his presidency building. The pressure was political. The result was scientific, and the scientific result said what the politics required it to say. Classified acoustic data collected from SOFAR channel hydrophone monitoring stations in the South Atlantic in the hours following the event recorded a signal consistent with a shallow underwater or near-surface detonation at approximately the right time and location. That data was not made available to the Ruina panel during its deliberations. Why acoustic data collected by U.S. monitoring infrastructure during the investigation of a potential nuclear test was withheld from the panel? Investigating that test is not a question the available documents answer. A Defense Intelligence Agency document obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, created in 1994, states internally that the 1979 event was in all probability a joint South African-Israeli nuclear test. The document remained classified for 15 years after its creation. The mainstream institutional position has been maintained formally despite the successive declassifications that have progressively undermined it. The Ruina panel's probable not conclusion remains the official U.S. government finding. The academic argument for that position is that the evidence remains ambiguous, that no government has confirmed the test, and that the consequences of a definitive finding would have been diplomatically destabilizing. But there is a difference between ambiguity and suppression. The acoustic data was withheld from the investigation. The AFTAC finding was overridden by political appointees. The internal DIA assessment was classified for 15 years. In a world that currently relies on international nuclear monitoring systems to enforce non-proliferation agreements, the Vela incident is not a historical curiosity. It is a precedent, and the precedent is this. When the political cost of a finding is high enough, the finding can be made to disappear. From a buried nuclear secret in the South Atlantic, we travel to the Arizona desert, where 8 people sealed themselves inside a glass shell and tried to build a miniature Earth from scratch. And when it began to fail, quietly and systematically, the data that could have told us why became the subject of a legal dispute. The full truth of what happened inside that glass is, in important ways, still not available to us. Biosphere 2, September 26, 1991. 8 people walk through an airlock in Oracle, Arizona, and seal it behind them. They will not breathe outside air for 2 years. They will grow their own food, recycle their own water, and live inside a 3.14-acre glass and steel structure containing a rainforest, a miniature ocean, a savanna, a desert, a mangrove wetland, a farm, and all the ecological systems required to sustain life independently of the planet outside. The cost of building this structure was $200 million. The ambition behind it was to design the blueprint for colonizing Mars. If it worked, humanity had a template for survival beyond Earth. If it failed, and it did, in ways the people who funded it spent years trying to control the narrative around, the failure revealed something about the fragility of the system we are all already living inside. Biosphere 2 was funded primarily by Texas oil billionaire Edward Bass through a company called Space Biospheres Ventures, with scientific consultation from the Smithsonian Institution and informal observer status from NASA. Its designers believed they had modeled the ecological dynamics of the system with sufficient precision to sustain 8 humans indefinitely in a sealed environment. Within weeks of sealing, they discovered they had not. Oxygen concentrations inside Biosphere 2 began dropping almost immediately. By January of 1993, 16 months into the mission, the internal oxygen level had fallen from 20.9%, the atmospheric norm, to 14.5%. That is equivalent to the oxygen availability at an altitude of approximately 17,500 feet, well above the threshold at which cognitive impairment and physical deterioration become measurable. The crew was experiencing chronic hypoxia. They were fatigued, slow, and struggling. An emergency oxygen injection was made in January of 1993. That injection invalidated the sealed system experimental premise. It was not disclosed publicly for months. The cause was identified by atmospheric chemist Jeff Severinghaus and colleagues in a paper published in the journal EOS in 1994. The rich agricultural soils introduced to support food production were loaded with microbes that consumed oxygen through respiration at rates far exceeding what the system's plant mass could offset through photosynthesis. Additionally, the concrete in the structure was absorbing carbon dioxide through a process called carbonation, disrupting the carbon-oxygen balance in ways the designers had not modeled and could not have anticipated without this specific data. The knowledge that concrete absorbs CO2 at scale in a closed system is now standard in ecological modeling. It was purchased at $200 million and 8 people's 2-year ordeal. Carbon dioxide levels inside the biosphere swung between 1,000 and 4,000 parts per million, depending on daily cloud cover, against a design target of approximately 350. The fluctuation tracked sunlight directly, confirming that photosynthesis was the dominant oxygen source and that the system was nowhere near the stability its designers had projected. Of 25 vertebrate animal species introduced to Biosphere 2, 19 went extinct within the mission period. All pollinating insect species died. The agricultural section required hand pollination by crew members to produce any food at all. Caloric intake dropped to approximately 1,800 calories per day per person, below the minimum recommended for adults under physical labor conditions. By the mission's midpoint, measurable weight loss and physiological stress markers were documented in every crew member. When Columbia University took over management of the facility in 1995, a data ownership dispute with Space Biospheres Ventures led to a period in which critical mission logs and atmospheric data sets were held in legal limbo, inaccessible to independent researchers. A physical confrontation between management factions during this period resulted in a court injunction. The full mission data was not freely available for peer review for several years after the mission's end. NASA's internal assessment of the mission's implications for long-duration life support design was not published. Given that Biosphere 2 had been built partly as a proxy test for closed-loop life support on Mars, and given that its fundamental assumptions about microbial activity and oxygen dynamics proved incorrect, the operational implications for any crewed Mars mission were significant. Whether that assessment was kept internal for institutional reasons or strategic ones is not something the public record tells us. The scientific community's response to Biosphere 2 was largely to categorize it as a noble failure that produced genuine data. And that is fair. The oxygen depletion findings, the concrete carbonation effect, and the species extinction patterns have informed ecological modeling in important ways. The experiment failed by its own marketing terms, but succeeded as science in the uncomfortable sense that it produced results no one wanted. But there is a difference between a failed experiment and a suppressed conclusion. If the mission's most significant finding was that the fundamental assumptions underlying closed-loop life support were wrong, and if that finding contradicted what was being told to Congress and the public about the feasibility of Mars colonization at the time, the institutional motive to control how that failure was interpreted was real and present. The data dispute was not purely a corporate governance problem. It was a fight over who got to define what the failure meant. And in the years it took to resolve that fight, the window for independent peer review of the raw results quietly closed. 8 people, a glass shell, a failed miniature Earth. The oxygen running out while the data sat in a lawyer's office, 10 items, and the pattern is impossible to ignore. Every item on this list has the same architecture. Something is discovered, documented, or witnessed. The documentation suggests that the official account of what is possible, what has happened, who is responsible, or what is out there is incomplete. And then, with a consistency that should at minimum give us pause, the documentation disappears. The memo is filed under unexplained lights. The records are burned 2 days before the subpoena arrives. The immunity deal is classified for 50 years. The acoustic data is withheld from the investigation. The mission logs sit in a lawyer's office while the ecosystem collapses. The mainstream position on all of this is not without force, and it deserves to be held alongside the alternative. Bureaucratic institutions suppress information not because it is explosive, but because suppression is the path of least resistance for systems that move slowly and fear accountability. Pattern recognition is itself a bias. We notice the things that were hidden and forget the hundreds of unremarkable things that were disclosed without ceremony. Cold War paranoia produced decisions that look sinister in retrospect but were made under genuine strategic pressure by people who believed they were protecting something. Hold all of that. It is true. But hold this alongside it. Operation Paperclip is not a theory. MKUltra is not a rumor. Unit 7. 31's immunity deal is in a declassified memorandum. The HALT memo is a United States Air Force document. The $22 million for AAWSAP is confirmed by Senate testimony. The Vela double flash is satellite data. The Biosphere 2 oxygen crisis is peer-reviewed science. These are not fringe claims. These are documented facts that were hidden and that we know only because of accidental document survival, Freedom of Information Act requests, decades of persistence by researchers who refused to accept silence as an answer, and the occasional archivist who forgot to burn the financial records. The question that connects all 10 is not whether any specific item represents a grand conspiracy. The question is simpler and more unsettling. What is sitting in a classified file right now, documented and verified and locked away, that we will be reading about in 30 years with the same feeling of recognition? What does the pattern of the last century tell us about the shape of the next one? History is not a settled story. It is an active negotiation between what happened and what those with the power to define the record chose to say happened. The people who accept the textbook version aren't wrong to accept it. Most of the time, the textbook is right. But the 10 items you just watched through are all cases where the textbook was incomplete deliberately, and the incompleteness was maintained by institutions that had something to lose from the full truth. Your brain is wired differently. You sat through 10 items and you were asking questions the whole time, not accepting the official answer as the final answer. That is not paranoia. That is the correct epistemic response to a record of institutional suppression that is documented, verified, and ongoing. This channel exists for that. For the people who read the footnotes, who notice when the answer is too smooth. Hit subscribe and stay in the archive. The dig is not finished. Every document you just heard about was real. Every suppression was confirmed. Every file that was burned left a shadow in the records that survived. Governments don't destroy boring documents. They destroy the ones that matter, the ones that change the shape of what we think we know. What was buried wasn't always buried because it was dangerous. Sometimes it was buried because it was true, and the truth was inconvenient for the story someone needed to tell. 10 discoveries, 10 acts of institutional silence, and somewhere, right now, there are 11 more waiting for someone who refuses to stop asking. Subscribe The archive is open.